The MCU is expanding rapidly, so I figured it would be a great time to go back in chronological order, phase-wise, and of course, we have to start with Captain America, the first Avenger. And I also have a theory about why Bucky didn't have to die, and that's later on in the video, so you might want to stick around. Salutations and fist bumps, folks. Let's ride. The events of Captain America, the first Avenger take place in 1942, as Steve Rogers shows his true colors as a soldier inside of the theater, which this is the first time that Steve actually says inside the MCU, I can do this all day. This is also the same time or the first appearance of Bucky inside of the MCU as well, who also is known as James Buchanan Barnes. We get the first iteration of Steve picking up what seems to be or looks like a shield, and we get a callback to that at the end when Steve actually fulfills his full-on duty as Captain America. A child actually does the exact same thing that he does here. And inside of this scene, we get a full-on glimpse on how and why Bucky and Steve are so close. We also get a glimpse of the World Exposition of Tomorrow, which actually is the exposition that Howard Stark is mentioning inside of Iron Man 2. Then at the fair in the next scene, you get a glimpse of Wonder Man, or this could also be an earlier version, the Human Torch. And this is also the first time that we hear the exchange between Steve and Bucky, "Don't do anything stupid until I get there," which again establishes their relationship far beyond what we see here inside of this film. We then get a great shot of Erskine and Steve in an establishing shot to establish what's going to happen later on, to which Erskine asks him a question, specifically trying to get at his heart, understanding who he is, and Steve replies, "I don't like bullies no matter where they come from." And that is exactly what Erskine was looking for in terms of the super soldier serum, or who to give it to, because we find out later that he also gave it to Schmidt, who didn't actually have the particular heart that Erskine was looking for in terms of who would actually be able to carry this out. We then get our first glimpse of Dr. Zola, which he is in a familiar form that he later actually takes, and that also shows up in What If. And here we get a glimpse of the Tesseract, which by the way, at that point in that time was known as the Artifact. Later on, as Steve tries to become a soldier, he runs across Peggy Carter, who at this point has become the woman of his dreams, which in the next scene, she's actually really impressed with him because of what he does that no one else does in terms of falling on a grenade, and it actually shows why he is the perfect choice for the super soldier serum, specifically because he uses his brain and his heart in battle at the same time, which is carried through to other events and battles, specifically in the later part of the MCU, because he is always looking out for the little guy. That's his worldview and how he sees everything in terms of his own struggles, because that's where he came from as well. And the next scene solidifies the choice for Steve, because Erskine is dead set on choosing Steve for this mission, but the general doesn't seem sold on him being the person to get it. Erskine is not looking for physical abilities because that's going to come. He's more so looking for the actual heart of the man, which the person that the general actually picked was behind a truck as this entire scene in terms of the grenade was going on. So his heart check was not there.
You were scared, huh? Don't be scared.
And like I said before, Peggy is now slowly starting to fall for him because of what she sees in his character. And then we see why the dance that happens between Peggy and Steve in Endgame is so important to him now, because the conversation had here in terms of him and Peggy shows his undying or unwavering conviction to stand up what he believes in and never back off of it. We then hear the code phrase,
"Wonderful weather this morning, isn't it?"
Yes, but I always carry an umbrella.
which tells her that whoever says that on the other end actually belongs there and they're a part of S.H.I.E.L.D., or so she believes. And we get another appearance of Howard Stark, or at least an earlier version of Howard Stark. By the way, Stark tech is used a lot inside of the MCU. That also comes with inspiration from the comics as well. In the comics, you would primarily see a lot of the Fantastic Four in the earlier versions in Golden Age and stuff like that. And in more modern situations, you would see Stark Industries because it's trying to go in sync as much as possible with the actual MCU. Then Steve goes into the chamber as the little guy, and out swole. But in the midst of all of the celebration that has now happened because of the successful injection with Steve, no one really understands or realizes that the guy that was just curious about the tech now has left his journal on the seat, and nobody pays attention to the fact that it also has a bomb inside of it. This is also something to take note of here because the vial of serum was conveniently placed for him to actually grab it. So in term, or was there someone else working with him that we aren't actually privy to? And then as the guy is leaving the speakeasy, now why did he have to shoot Grandmama? She wasn't doing nothing. She was just minding her business with a Tommy gun. But anyway, Agent Carter shows Ranger aim in terms of how she's able to pinpoint and hit the driver of the car. Now, hold up for just 1 minute. When Cap, I can call him Cap now, right? When Cap goes after the bomber guy and jumps on the car, he loses control of the car and it starts to flip. That man in the driver's seat had no business being alive after that happened, specifically because this is still the 1940s. Safety in automobiles was still just a thing that was starting to become a larger topic. It was not the way that it is now. Sure, yes, the car is metal, so it probably had a little bit more give than it does now in terms of aluminum cars, but that man flipped multiple times. He had no business still being alive and walking out of that car the way that he did. Like, come on, man. Like, but I guess then Cap gets grazed by a bullet as he holds up a object that is very similar again to a shield. And this is something fairly influential to Cap's character in the MCU because he guards up like this inside of the comics as well. Cap then swims a 500 meter in less than 30 seconds and ragdolls old boy out of the watercraft that he was currently in. And in this scene, we also see the super soldier serum break, similar to a future scene in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And we then hear the famous words for the first time, "Hail Hydra," as the henchman takes a tooth that actually is a pill of cyanide and dies. But this is not before he says to Steve that if you cut off one head, 2 more will grow back, which is exactly what Red Skull says later on, and you hear it multiple times inside this movie as well. But if you don't know, Hydra in the MCU is actually created as an offshoot from Hitler and ran by Johann Schmidt, who later on takes the name of Red Skull because of what happens to him after he takes the serum, and because of the side effects that happen to him, a red scab is pretty much all the way over his nose. But before heading into his lab, you can actually see the scar underneath his skin showing his red skull. And then once he goes on a killing spree inside of his lab, once found out by Hitler's goons, if you pay attention, you'll see that the first guy actually dodges pretty swiftly the first 2 shots. And as we get to the end of this scene, when I first saw this movie, I originally thought that this guy was just screaming to be screaming because he's about to die. But actually he says Schmidt loudly as he's about to get hit with the ray, which by the way, again, is Red Skull's actual last name. After all of this happens in front of the Hydra goons and also Dr. Zola, Hydra is now completely in the forefront. But we later find out that Hydra had actually been around or spoken of in briefings for a while.
I'm sure you've been reading our briefings. I'm on a number of committees, Colonel.
And then the word assemble is said for the first time here as well.
You don't take a soldier, a symbol like that, and hide him in a lab.
Although loosely, but still in terms or in regard to assembling a team, which we later know them as, or know this team as, the Avengers. We then find out that the reproduction of the serum is actually locked inside of Steve's genes, so they have to take a lot of blood from him. He actually makes a joke of it when he says, "Do you have enough?" To which Peggy says that the reproduction of everything is going to take years, but we know that that actually isn't true, because it's possible that way earlier, even around the time that Steve comes out of the ice, possibly, that someone found out how to replicate the super soldier serum in the time that he was in the ice, which is still 70 plus years or so. But in between that time, what I'm saying is possibly someone had the idea or knew how to get a hold of the serum or a prototype of the serum to make another batch later on. But the MCU doesn't necessarily say that that actually happens. This is just a fan theory that I'm looking into and possibly reading a little bit too much into, but this is something that I've always thought about. The group then seen in the opening showcase is a depiction of the Howling Commando. And by the way, this group was a part of the original characters for Marvel, and the original name for the group was Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commando. We then get a brief look at the original comic for Captain America, which, by the way, during this Star Spangled Man tour, this is where he actually picks up the name of Captain America. Then, after the conversation with the general, Steve finds out that the group that he was just in front of is the 107th, and that means that Bucky Barnes should be here. When in fact he finds out that he is not, he goes on a pretty much suicide rescue mission without having any backup. But we all know that because of the serum, he doesn't really need it at all. Then as Steve heads behind enemy lines, he comes up to reactor rings that look very similar to the reactor, the arc reactor that Iron Man, Tony Stark, actually wears in the beginning of his stint as Iron Man. We then get a close-up glimpse of the Howling Commandos inside of a tank as the battle that happens after Steve breaks out the 107th ensues. And in this scene, we see Dum Dum Dugan and Gabe Jones having a brief conversation on how Gabe actually speaks multiple languages and why. Which, by the way, Jones, or Gabe Jones, is actually mentioned in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. loosely as well, because it is believed that Triplet inside of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is his grandson. Then once Bucky is rescued, Steve comes to the realization that things have now become a little bit hotter than before. And the reason why that is because Red Skull now believes that he is completely outmatched by Steve now having the super soldier serum inside of his body. Because what Red Skull then does is self-destruct everything inside of that lab. Red Skull then reveals himself to Bucky and Steve after he takes off his face and throws it in the fire. And as he does this, he mentions that the super soldier serum should have been his, which, by the way, it was, but he had side effects because it was too early.
It should have been me, not him! It's not fair!
Steve then shows off the abilities given to him by the serum when he attempts to jump across a fire-laden area, or a fire-laden pit pretty much, from one side of a panel to the other. And the editing in this particular scene is flawless in terms of depicting or setting the stage for the first time seeing this, at least, that Steve doesn't make it out of the fire. Further playing up this fact, when the general is sending home or sending a letter to the president saying that Steve Rogers is KIA because he doesn't know where he is. But that is then short-lived because the 107th is then seen with Captain America leading them back to base, which then leads us to a president scene that Cap is nowhere to be found in, but we do see a cameo from the late great Stan Lee, which I really do miss those cameos. Thank you, Stan. Then preparations are then made for the guerrilla warfare that is going to be led by Cap. Cap then debriefs the entire group on where the weapons depot actually is, which again, he's doing this by memory because of his super soldier abilities. And now Cap is an even bigger hit with the ladies, because first, take notice of the fact that Peggy, when she comes into the scene after the rescue mission of the 107th, she's wearing a red dress.
Lord have mercy.
And no one else in that particular scene, or really in scenes after that, is wearing something like that. No other woman, I should say, is wearing anything like that. And she's only paying attention to Steve, not even looking in Bucky's direction, which before in the beginning of the movie, that was completely flipped on its head. But she stands out inside of her red dress, and everything else is in a bland or dull color. It put me in the mind of Schindler's List in terms of color being the main driving force of the scene to depict what we should be feeling as the audience. But Steve's luck with the ladies is something that we see countless times inside of the MCU, even for a brief stint with Natasha. The guerrilla warfare mission is then carried out, hitting each of the depots that Hydra had been using for weapons, which we actually get the chance to see the effects of slightly in real time as Red Skull drives up to one of the burnt down buildings that was just blown up moments before he arrived. And that then leads us to the infamous train mission, and since pretty much everyone should know what happens here, I won't bore with details. But what I will ask you to do is take a closer look at how or why Bucky didn't actually need to die. Because when the other enemy with the blaster shows up, Cap uses the shield to protect Bucky, as he should. The blast then hits the shield, bounces off of it, and ricochets to the left, blowing a hole inside of the train. Now, pay close attention here. When Bucky picks up the shield, there are two places that he can go. Left, which is going closer to the hole, or he could go right, which is closer to Cap and other obstacles. He could have used the shield to walk over closer to Cap because he does have time before the enemy takes another shot. But instead, he stands and fires, which shifts his momentum closer to the edge. And by the way, there are two of them that fire from Bucky's gun, and as he does it, he shuffles his feet just a little bit, more specifically on the second shot. But what he should have done is stay behind the shield since he had it and moves closer to Cap. Or he could have also thrown it at the enemy, because later on in the movie, one of the Howling Commandos picks up the shield and tosses it like a frisbee. So if that is the possibility for just a regular human to do, then Bucky should have been able to do it as well, even if it wasn't as hard as Cap would throw the actual shield. It would have given them more time, and Bucky wouldn't have gotten hit with another ray, shifting him out into the hole. Another point here to make this even bigger in terms of why Bucky didn't need to die: if Cap actually takes out the guy that is shooting at them before he goes into the room that Bucky is battling with another enemy in, none of this happens at all. This then leads us into battle with Cap as he attempts to avenge his fallen friend. And it's in this scene that I was talking about, that the guy takes Cap's shield and tosses it like a frisbee. So that's further solidifying to me that Bucky didn't need or have to die, because he could have picked up the shield and at least tossed it and gave himself a chance. Then people get shot, stuff blows up, and Steve is now chasing a plane, first on foot and then inside of Red Skull's actual car, which it is here now, right in this moment, that Peggy decides that it is a great time to be making out in front of the enemy, let alone that there are propellers literally inches from your head, but nobody cares about that, right? Cap then climbs into the bay of the ship and is now shown bombs that are going to multiple different places, but he is not necessarily triggered until he sees his home of New York.
I'm from New York, New York.
Red Skull actually says to Cap that he could have had the power of the gods, which suggests that he is possibly talking about the potential inside of the Tesseract, which now gives him the ability later on to actually wield Mjolnir. After the battle, Red Skull is then sent to Vormir, where he guards the Soul Stone. And at the end, Peggy and Steve make their date before Steve ultimately heads into the ice. But this is the beginning of Steve's hero arc, which is juxtaposed to Tony's, because Steve automatically makes himself selfless to save other people, which Tony actually never really did until the end inside of Endgame. But by the end in Endgame, Steve actually does have a 180 kind of situation when he now is more self-serving in the way that he believes that he now can and should stay with Peggy in that moment. After Steve goes into the ice, we open with the mid-credits scene at the end, where a woman who favors Peggy a lot walks into a room with the baseball game playing from the 1940s. The same one that Cap actually attended, which then tips him off that something is not right here. But inside of this area, you can see the great lengths that S.H.I.E.L.D. went to portray that Cap or Steve was inside of his own time. So much so that it looks like they created a fake world, or almost like a movie set type of world similar to the Truman Show. Then breaking out of what seems to be a cage or a jail cell to him, he realizes, or now is told, that he had been asleep for 70 plus years and is now waking up inside of Times Square in New York. And the only thing that he remembers, because again, he's been asleep, so the last thing that he remembers doing is setting a date with Peggy. So this now drives everything that happens to him inside the MCU, at least until Endgame. And then the final cutscene sets up how Fury actually shows up in the first phase inside of the MCU, more specifically from the shadows as a voice, and then we see him later. But each time it happens at the end until we get to the Avengers. Now that we have a grasp on Cap, we need to talk about Iron Man. So head right here and I'll see you over there.